Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Leila Logizico. I'm the president of the City Club of New York. The City Club of New York is thrilled to welcome you to this evening's webinar. We're here tonight to focus on one of the most pressing domestic policies of our time, housing. Housing is an issue that affects every country, every city, every community. President Biden, in his State of the Union address, mentioned a comprehensive housing plan. He stated, "We've cut red tape so that builders can get federal financing, which is already helping build a record 1.7 million new housing units nationwide." The field is flooded with claims that increasing housing supply will unquestionably solve the housing crisis. But is it unquestionable? Advocates claim that housing of any kind is the only way to get the housing crisis under control, because the crisis is a result of supply and demand imbalance. But the housing market is not a monolith. Instead, it is made up of numerous submarkets, from public housing to uber luxury. Do they all respond to the same forces? And are they competing against each other? And one major player that often goes unnoticed and unmentioned is the lending market. So, are there simple solutions to a complex problem? I'm thrilled to present our panel of experts who come to us from all over the world. We're stretching ourselves across more time zones than there are rooms in a billionaire's row penthouse. 17 time zones, to be precise. Professor Patrick Condon is an urban planner and author. He's a professor with the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He became the James Taylor Chair in Landscape and Livable Environments. He is the author of Broken City, Land Speculation, Inequality, and Urban Crisis, published by the University of British Columbia Press and coming out on May 28. Vishaan Chakrabarti is an architect, author, and thought leader based in New York City. He is the founder of the architectural firm Practice for Architecture and Urbanism. He is the author of The Architecture of Urbanity, published by Princeton University Press and coming out in September of this year. And Dr. Cameron Murray is an economist with the Fresh Economic Thinking, a think tank based in Australia. Dr. Murray specializes in the economics of property and housing systems, natural resources management, and corruption. He just published The Great Hijack, The Hoaxes and Myth Keeping Prices High for Renters and Buyers in Australia, published by Allen and Unwin. And to moderate this conversation, I am thrilled to introduce one of the most knowledgeable persons I know on the topic of land use and real estate. Aaron Elstein, senior reporter with Crain's New York Business, has covered this beat for over 20 years, currently for Crain's, and for the Wall Street Journal prior to that. A few words about our format tonight. Our three panelists will give us presentations, and then they will discuss the issue. And then you, the audience, will have a chance to ask questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type your questions. You don't have to wait. You can do it right now, or you can wait for the conversation to unfold and then type your question as they become more present in your minds. Aaron, I look forward to tonight's conversation. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Leila. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name's Aaron Elstein. I'm a real estate reporter at Crain's New York Business. We're a business newspaper in New York City, as the name might suggest. I've written about business in New York for 27 years, since moving to the bright lights of the big city in 1996. I worked for a small newspaper in Springfield, Illinois. The best way I can understand housing in New York City is, well, through my own experience. And when I arrived here, finding a job was relatively easy. It was the great bull market of the 1990s, and newspapers needed bodies. But finding an apartment was quite difficult. Eventually, I landed a one-bedroom apartment. The rent was $1,632.50 a month, with a roommate, which we converted the place into a very small two-bedroom apartment, and I could afford that on a reporter's salary. In today's money, the same apartment would cost $3,200 adjusted for inflation. However, I went to the apartment's website today, and I saw that a one-bedroom unit in that building now costs between $4,400 and $6,700 a month. I can assure everyone here that wages to journalists have not kept pace with this. So, a couple of numbers here to sort of tell you where we are in New York City here. One thing that's interesting to note is that this breakdown in housing and housing affordability in New York is not as old a phenomenon as you might think. Between 1980 and 2010, the city's population and its housing stock grew very closely together. They each rose 14% over that time. That's data from the New York City Comptroller's Office. I'll share that link later. It's been since 2010 really that this connection has broken down. Our housing stock in the city of New York has grown by 9% since 2010. Employment in the city has grown by 23%. Since 2019, rent in the city has grown by 28%. Wages have grown by 11%. These numbers are not news to policymakers, not to developers, not to anybody in the real estate world in New York. And people have been trying to deal with this problem for years with a variety of mechanisms, either by trying to suppress rent increases or offering incentives to increase the supply of housing. But this supply-demand imbalance, which is what we have, has defied solutions. And here we are to talk about them. So let's talk this evening about what can be done about this. We can talk about whether this is a problem that is seen in other cities like New York, and again, what is to be done? Mr. Chakrabarti, please take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. So I think I'm on this panel, Leila, thank you for inviting me, because of an article we did in collaboration with the New York Times that was published last December. And I'm happy to share some of that. I just want to start by saying, so I'm not an economist, I'm not a PhD like some of my fellow colleagues here, and so I'm not going to profess to be. I am a former city official from the aftermath of 9/11. And one of the things I know from that period is that New York is an extraordinarily unique city. We have a lot of very unique economic and demographic dynamics. And the other thing I would just say is knowing many of the people who kind of, I was interested in Leila's introduction because knowing some of the people who are housing advocates, I cannot think of a single advocate who thinks that supply is some kind of silver bullet. I have yet to hear any reasonable person say that, just by increasing supply, that we are going to somehow address this enormous city's housing needs. Most of the housing advocates I know are also very concerned about things like tenant harassment, preservation, any number of other issues. So I think one of the important starting points here is to not paint people into corners where somehow this is a black and white or binary issue, because there aren't any simple solutions. There are no silver bullets. It's an extraordinarily complex topic. And I think it's important to kind of begin with that. I am going to try to share my screen. Sorry for the pause here, but hopefully, can everyone see that?
We can see the screen loading.
You can't see the screen? I can see it on mine.
Not on mine.
Huh, how strange.
Do you want to stop and start again?
Let me try one last thing.
How's
that?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the hard copy version for those of you who are still old enough to read the hard copy. This came out in early January. There were two articles, ours as well as one from a member of the New York Times editorial board, Binya Applebaum, who did write a very, very supply side article. Ours was a bit different. We talked about the fact we were given this open-ended question about supply in New York, and where supply might go, because obviously our city is a big congested city and a lot of people feel like, well, there's no room. We beg to differ. And so we asked a sort of different question. We said, how can we meet our housing needs without changing the character of our neighborhoods? And that was a really critical thing. So we weren't going into landmark districts. We weren't going into NYCHA housing sites. We were trying to keep new housing within the scale of the city, and also within the constraints that I think are very important in terms of climate and transportation orientation. So we only selected sites that were within a half a mile of mass transit. We did not use any sites that were in the vulnerable flood zone. So we were actually very conservative about that. Even though you can build in flood zones, we did not suggest building in any flood zones. And we found over 10,000 sites, over 1,700 acres of developable land. That's twice the size of Central Park using that criteria. And we used 3 types of housing that have different economics associated with them. Low-rise, kind of 3-story housing that is actually quite gentle in its density, but still transit-oriented. Mid-block, what's known as block and plank. And I should say we designed a lot of affordable housing in our office. And so we're very familiar with these different construction technologies and their impacts on cost. And then high-rise buildings where those could be contextual. And the way we define contextual is we looked at a radius around any given site, about an 800-foot radius for neighborhood locations, a slightly larger radius for arterial locations, and said we would not build taller than the highest buildings in those territories. And so we have a couple of before and afters. This is in the Bronx in a transit-oriented site, single-family neighborhood, where we said you could tuck in a 6-unit apartment building that's about the height of the ridge beam of the house that's 2 houses down. In Brooklyn, all of our sites, by the way, we never ever suggested tearing down any existing housing. This is a 1-story grocery store that would get replaced by a grocery store and 58 units of housing. Again, quite gentle density, pegged to the scale of the nearby apartment buildings. And then in Queens, a very transit-rich site where obviously the scale, the contextual scale is much taller, a 250-unit building. And then finally, we did look at some office to residential conversions and did not actually get where we looked at like converting workspace. This is a very expensive undertaking and didn't yield a lot of units from office to residential conversion. The bottom line is we found across those 10,000 sites, the capacity to build 520,000 homes for New Yorkers, about homes for about 1.3 million New Yorkers. Again, near transit, out of the flood zones, without disturbing landmark districts, all within neighborhood scale and neighborhood character. I'd like to stress again, we never suggested that this was somehow a silver bullet to New York's housing crisis. We were simply trying to go through the thought experiment of saying, if we wanted to build more housing, could we do it in a way that was in keeping with the scale of New York City? The last thing I just want to say is we actually got tremendously positive response on this article from many community groups. The most negative response we got was from the real estate industry, who actually was not terribly interested in building more contextual buildings and these mid-rise buildings. So again, a nuanced kind of complex response to a nuanced and complex problem. So I'll stop there and hopefully we can discuss it further. Thanks.
Vishaan, I have a question for you right off the bat here. What was the real estate industry's difficulty with this? I mean, you're suggesting ways for them to build more. That should be everything they want.
I think it has to do, Aaron, with the fact that there's not just one monolithic real estate industry in the city. There are very good builders who are more community scale builders, and they are not that well represented. The larger real estate industry is largely representing, 10, 12 very large real estate entities. They're largely interested in building very big towers in, Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. Not so much mid-rise buildings in Queens and the Bronx and so forth. Part of that is they argue the economics of that is very difficult. We can debate that. The last thing is, in the article, we also suggested raising taxes on vacant and underutilized property in order to incentivize development on that property, which was another thing that the real estate industry, I don't think, likes very much. And so those were their main objections.
How did the mayor react to it?
We got very good reactions from both City Hall and the governor's office. City Hall, of course, right now is trying to put through their City of Yes proposals, which I think many of them are quite good. Some of them overlap with our proposals. Ours go a bit further in some circumstances. And so, but generally, it was a very positive response from both the city and state governments.
Thank you. Speedily and in our time, that's all I can say, please. All right. Patrick?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll share my screen. Let's see if this works. I trust you're seeing that.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, who am I? I've been in Vancouver for 30 odd years, and my specialty is sustainable urban design. I've had the pleasure of participating in a lot of the conversations that have led to basically a doubling of the population of our region, not just in Vancouver itself. And but the thing is, I grew up in Boston, and I hate the Yankees, but I love the city of New York. So I have some familiarity with what's going on the East Coast. And I've narrowed down what I want to share with you today to just talk about what has happened in Vancouver and why it might be instructive for people in other communities who are struggling with the same problem. And the take-home message is going to be, it's not the building that costs too much. It ends up being the land under the building that costs too much. And I'll try to explain why we've discovered that is a big problem for getting affordable housing. In Vancouver, the question that we've been asking for more than a decade now is, why didn't add tons of new density to existing neighborhoods lead to affordability as we had hoped? The idea being, of course, if you increase the supply of housing, that should mitigate price increases. And yet, as you can maybe see, since the 1980s, we've had this increasing cost of housing, which is more than a doubling, which is in fact close to a tripling of the inflation-adjusted cost of housing, while that's shown in the blue line, while shown in the brown line is the average wages, also inflation adjusted. So there has been an enormous separation between the price of housing and the ability of people to afford that housing that goes beyond comprehension. And as it says, it now takes the average wage earner 29 years to save up enough money for the 20% down payment, which is required. Crazy. As a response to this, not just me, but many people in the region have participated in the encouragement of this city to do more than any other North American city, including New York City, to add new housing units, to the point where Vancouverism as an idea has become globally famous for adding a lot of housing. This is a view of downtown in the 1970s on the top, and roughly what it looks like now on the bottom, where we've more than tripled housing units throughout the city, including in the downtown in this view. But not all of it has been downtown. Also, the lower density areas have been densified with lane houses, duplexing, secondary suites, and so forth. So we added supply to fix this problem that we saw emerging. We tripled housing units citywide since 1970. Housing units tripled all through infill or change of use. We doubled the population of this relatively small center city, tripled housing units citywide since 1970, all through infill. No other North American city has come close to this proportionate achievement of a tripling of housing units in many different locations in the city and in many different density configurations. Thus, I and others have reluctantly concluded if adding new density, new supply should bring down prices, Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. By most measures, it has the most expensive housing in North America. It raises the question why, because it does defy conventional wisdom and has disappointed many of us in the profession over these decades. The answer seems to be that our efforts to increase the allowable density throughout the city in various forms has been ancillary, and some would say caused an increase in land price that coincides with the value of that new upzone. In this simple example, you see that the speculation is that you quadruple the allowable density on a parcel, and unfortunately, we find a quadrupling of the value of that land. That assertion of mine is backed up by the assessment information. This shows two examples. In the blue line, you see the rise in land value over time since about 2006 to now for both a single family home up on the top and, interestingly, a much higher density project on the bottom. The point of this is to show you that as density increases, the proportional relationship of land value to building value stays the same, defying what we hoped would be a diluting of that land value when we, on a per unit basis, when we allowed for additional density. Sad but true. Land value in Vancouver and largely throughout the English-speaking world, in most density configurations, has proceeded to far exceed the value of the building which is on it. And our development practices often accelerate that when we allow additional density, quite unfortunately. So land value is many times higher than building value, both here and elsewhere. It's unaffordable in either case, and sadly, adding density does not fix it. The question is, what can you do? Well, actually, Vancouver, compared to other cities, has done a much better job of dealing with this land price issue through a process that we call capturing land lift. It's basically a tax on development when additional density is allowed that is intended to capture a calculated value of that new authorization at 80% of the new value, leaving 20% of the new value on the table for the landowner to stimulate the sale. And it was through that process, pioneered in the 80s, the only case of this tool being used in North America, even largely to today. And it financed the open space system, which, if you've been to Vancouver, it's quite impressive. When we captured 80% of the rezoned land value for social infrastructure, it financed a lavish production of community facilities such as this Yaletown Roundhouse Community Center. And most importantly, it also was the financing mechanism for social housing, rather than that financing mechanism coming from the provincial or the federal government, which you might expect. It actually came out of the value of that land lift. So the financing was in every sense of the word captured from what would have otherwise gone to the landowner, subject to a development that didn't have this land left tax as a requirement of the rezoning. So in my last minute here, I'll give you a US example that does it in a somewhat different way, but it's essentially the same thing. It's a tax on increased land value. Here is the example. It's the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place that I'm very familiar with. And they achieved the same thing by saying throughout the city, you can double density no matter what the existing density is, but in return, you must guarantee 100% affordable units will be the result of that. And there are various conditions, deed restrictions and so forth, that insist that that affordability metric will be tied to median household income in the region, and that it will be tied to median household income in perpetuity as well. I think this is a very interesting example that should be more widespread, particularly in American urban areas, because the Supreme Court and various cases throughout the past 50 years have verified that this is certainly an appropriate use of so-called police power to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. The real estate community may not like it unless they have a nonprofit arm, and then they do and can like it. I want to underline that point. The problem that we see is not what the developers do, it's what the land speculators do. The unaffordability issue is a problem of land speculation and land price increase, not developers extracting too much profit from a project. My last point. If you're going to do that, take the example from Cambridge, Massachusetts to heart. It took them 4 years to get the citizens throughout the city, and much of the city is very low density, high income neighborhoods and so forth. So the politics of getting agreement throughout the city of Cambridge was very rich and required the planning department, with the assistance of their urban design staff, to go out into the community and converse with the community to the extent necessary to create comfort that those new interventions, even though twice the density of the existing block or neighborhood, if you will, would be compatible in scale and type to what was already there, not promoting a very disruptive and highly aggressive change in density. And also, this will be my last comment, the politics of that situation was that the people in the city eventually were more in favor of this affordable housing overlay, because it would be a place that their sons and daughters and the service workers who made their city run could afford to live in. They were more favorable to that type of housing than they would have or were to housing that was market housing. Go figure. So I'll leave it with that. I don't know if I've exceeded my 5 minutes, but I'm done.
Patrick, I have a question for you.
Hey, wait a minute, except to say, buy my book, Broken City, on May 28th.
Absolutely, buy Patrick's book. Patrick, has Boston's experience with affordable housing, I guess, been better than New York's? And New York has a terrible difficulty in keeping what the affordable housing it has, never mind adding to it.
Well, if you're talking about Vancouver, I've emphasized some of the successes, but the failures are similar. The market housing, which is essentially in two categories. If you're speaking only to rental, there's some relatively affordable, but it's still the highest priced rental in all of Canada for a major metropolitan city. We have 15% of our housing is already in non-market housing. The bulk of that is in the form of co-op housing, which in North American terms is a relatively high proportion. What we have here is the same level of argument that is occurring that you referenced in New York, the supposition that bringing in a lot of new market high-rise rental will in time reduce prices, but the countervailing research information is that for various reasons, when that stock is attracted into usually neighborhoods that already have a high percentage of rental housing, the rental housing that is replaced tends to be lost, and the rental housing that comes in the new market form tends to be beyond the reach of average wage earners. So there's a conundrum there that our regional attempt to add rental housing in ways that, of course, I favor from the point of view of transportation and diversity of house types, which I've written books about in the past, has unfortunately coordinated with a dramatic increase in the difference between average rents and the rents in these new units that can be as much as 100% more.
You know, that's sobering. I was a believer that increasing the supply would help deal with the demand problem, but I'm starting to wonder about that. Cameron, you've been waiting a little while from Brisbane. Please.
Thanks very much, Aaron, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. So I'm the, I think, economist on the panel, and I'm also from Australia, so I can bring a bit of a different perspective to the other panelists. So perhaps while people are listening, they can go to fresheconomicthinking.com and put their email in and sign up to learn about economics and housing. But I'm going to, while you do that, I'm going to make 5 points that I don't think have been covered yet. And I think the first one, given our topic is moving beyond the dogma of supply and demand, I think as an economist, I need to push back and say, no, we need to double down, but be much more specific about what we mean with supply and demand. So that's my first point. Because in economics, supply doesn't mean how many houses there are. Absolutely not. It only means the willingness to sell something in a particular period of time. And it's a tautology that more supply pushes down price. That is the definition of how market exchange works. That's why we have housing busts when everyone tries to sell their home at once, right? So we need to be more specific about what we mean rather than use supply in an ad hoc way to mean the number of homes or this or that, when in economics, and economists, I blame you all for using this inappropriately, supply should only mean one particular thing, which is the willingness to sell an item in a particular period of time. Now, what that means is that if we take supply and demand seriously, it means there is a built-in speed limit on new housing, because building faster and selling or renting out those dwellings will push prices down. And you know what? Selling the next dwelling next year for less than what I sold this year is bad business, right? I asked a property manager of Australia's biggest build-to-rent project. So Australia's just moving into these corporate landlords that own mega projects. Most of our rental stock is owned by small investors with 1 or 2 dwellings. And they had 1,251 already complete dwellings. And I emailed them 3 years after it opened and said, how's it going? Do people like this new format? And they said, we've been on a staged release strategy so as not to flood the rental market. Soon we will release stage 4. They left 600 or 800 dwellings vacant for 3 years, brand new, because they didn't want to undermine the market price by oversupplying. And when I say supply, I mean willingness to sell in a particular period. So I think we need to take that seriously. Planners don't choose how many homes to build, only property owners do. You can regulate density, right? But property owners choose how many projects to build each year of any density, which is not regulated, all right? That responds to market conditions. So I think we need to be much more specific about what we mean by supply and demand. And we've got this weird idea that, you know, New York City can solve its price level by building more homes, ignoring the fact that people are still moving there and paying $4,000 to rent your old apartment, Aaron. Well, I mean, if people are willing to move there and pay $4,000 for the apartment and you build more apartments, aren't more people going to move there and pay $4,000? Like, and if it's too expensive, why aren't they leaving? Right? We've got this spatial equilibrium dimension where cities think, oh, we can make the housing cheaper, but people are free to leave if the housing's too expensive, and yet they choose to stay. So it's an interesting puzzle. And I don't think we should have the mindset that cities can just make their houses cheaper just by building in one city. And of course, cities don't build, right? You could, of course, flood the market with a public developer who doesn't want to be profitable and bring down prices, but you watch what other property developers will say when that happens. And in fact, that did happen historically, and there was a massive lobby during the New Deal in the 1930s to push against public housing competing with private housing. Speaking of the 1930s, let's just zoom out some more. So I want to zoom out in time and by location, okay? Because the idea that there's a shortage of homes is as old as the hills, and I think this is my second point. We get distracted by what's recently happened and ignore all of history every time the same thing happens again and again. So let me quote from a visitor to Sydney. They wrote this in their diary. They said, "The number of large houses just finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." Now, that wasn't Taylor Swift back in March on her global tour. That was Charles Darwin. In 1836, father of evolution, when he arrived in Sydney on the HMS Beagle, population of Australia, 20,000, right? No, population of New South Wales, so part of Australia, it was 20,000. And he said, what's going on? There's a housing crisis. Where's this? Why is there a shortage? There's land everywhere. He didn't even want to comment on the kangaroos or koalas because everyone was talking about housing in 1836. We had 1872. Frederick Engels wrote The Housing Question, a book about the shortage, and he wrote, "The so-called shortage, which plays such a great role in the press nowadays, does not consist in the fact that the working class generally lives in bad, overcrowded and unhealthy dwellings. The shortage is not something peculiar to the present. It is not even one of the sufferings peculiar to the modern proletariat, in contradistinction to all earlier oppressed classes." Okay, so now we're in the 1870s, same deal. And you know what's more interesting? One of Ed Glaser's papers about determining what price patterns are indicative of a shortage, well, I replicated that using archaeological records of property transactions in ancient Mesopotamia, 2,000 plus years ago. And you know what? The same pricing patterns were there. So I find it really, really interesting that we've got this like, focus on local politics as a cause of high prices, when we can zoom out and see every city at every point in history had some form of this crisis. We had in Australia in 1911 housing inquiry. Australia literally was federated in 1901. So within a decade, we said, oh, we've got a housing crisis. What should we do about it? And what's really interesting is every city I go to in the world, when I was in Vancouver with Patrick, he assured me that Vancouver's the worst city for housing. Okay, when I was in New Zealand, in Wellington, they assured me they were the worst. And every time I'm in Sydney, they assure me they're the worst, right? So we've got this really narrow focus on our own cities and ignoring this bigger picture that we're part of this global system, that people move between cities, and that we've had these same arguments for hundreds of years. Which brings me to my third point. No one knows what's wrong with housing or what to do about it. We talk about as if there's a crisis and we all know what it is, but when I go on my book tour, I get the audience to put their hand up. I say, if you're a homeowner, put your hand up, okay? And 2/3 put their hand up. And I say, leave it up if you're having a housing crisis, put it down if you're not. And no one leaves their hand up. Okay, put your hand up if you're a renter. Okay, leave it up if you're having a housing crisis. And maybe there's just a handful. Maybe 5 people out of 150 or 200 people are having a housing crisis. And yet we talk as if we know everybody's having a housing crisis. We're not. Everyone who owns property, they're having an investment return boom. They're very, very happy. And you know what? Most people own property, even in the US, in Australia, and Canada. Okay, so we've got to understand there's this symmetry, and that leads to some odd politics when it comes to housing. And in fact, there's another interesting pattern that we need to acknowledge is that, Aaron, you talked about your apartment when you first moved to New York and how expensive it's become. Well, what I find interesting is when you look at aggregate data, whether it's in the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and you go back in time, the typical rent to income ratio is a flat line. Rents just track incomes. Incomes rise 50%, rents rise 50%. It's been that way since the 1911 Rents Inquiry in New South Wales, the 1990s, all the way up to the 1990s, the 2000s, and today. So when we talk about, the price for this one dwelling has gone up, what we miss is this compositional change in the types of people who want to live there and their incomes and how they're outbidding each other. So I think we need to keep that in the back of our mind. And that also indicates why we've had the same argument for hundreds of years, right? If rents are rising with income, well, people whose income don't keep up with the average are always going to be those ones missing out. Those who do or exceed and grow faster, they're going to be fine. So there's always this competition, like this zero-sum game element to it. The fourth point I want to make is that globally, we've got this idea that, we should be building more houses today. We should be, as if we know what the market should do. Us, as an economist, I'm always skeptical. We know what should be done. We should be building more houses. Okay, how do you know we should be, right? In fact, what I find interesting is that globally, we actually decided we didn't want to build more houses back in 2002. We said, do you know what? Inflation's a problem. Let's put interest rates up to make it more difficult to build and buy houses. Let's make it more expensive. And then we just ignore that and go, it must be a shortage. It must be planning. I'm like, literally, we just increased interest rates massively to stop people building houses and make it difficult to buy homes, more expensive. And then we turn around and complain that it's expensive to buy a house and difficult to build. We're getting the exact outcome we desired with our monetary policy and completely ignore this macroeconomic situation that we've in many ways orchestrated for ourselves. So I find that a really odd thing, and really odd that not just in this conversation, but globally, we sort of ignore these macroeconomic cycles and settings. And the last thing to note is that I've looked everywhere, historically and internationally, for rich, wealthy cities with a lot of high-income people that have cheap homes. And you know what? There just aren't any. There aren't any. This is the nature of them because people use their incomes to outbid each other for the premium locations. And locations are a zero-sum game, right? They're all relative to each other. And so it always happens that wealthy cities become very expensive. And the wealthy cities that have a good diverse range of available housing for working class people have large socialized or subsidized housing sectors. And it's quite interesting because in one of the very, very many public inquiries into housing that we've had in Australia, we've had one literally every year for the last 30 years, an inquiry into why housing's expensive, an inquiry into why people can't buy homes. At the last one, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank was asked, have you looked for examples of cities that have made housing cheap by changing planning to get more supply? And the Deputy Governor said, no, we've got our team to look at that, and there aren't any, we can't find them. The only way housing gets cheap is everyone's income collapses and we have a recession. She said, that's the only examples I can find. And so we're having this debate with no anchoring in reality, in historical examples of cities that have got housing cheap by changing planning. And we're also having this debate with this weird ad hoc idea of supply and demand without being strictly clear about what we mean and strictly clear about the interpretation that if supply and demand is true, which it is, that also means that the market will self-limit how quickly it builds homes because it doesn't want to undermine its returns tomorrow. So I'm going to wrap it up there with that bit of perspective. If you're on the line, that's the book you want to buy, where you'll get these perspectives and many, many more, and lots of introduction to the economics of housing. Thanks, Aaron.
You know, Cameron, I just had a question for you about Australia. In the United States, interest rates are a good deal higher than they've been in a long, long time. And the thinking is that is discouraging people from selling homes who otherwise might. And that is affecting, the price of housing because there's less available, less inventory. Sounds reasonable to me. I'm not sure that's true. Do you buy that thesis?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think the effect is very small. You've got to understand that in the US, most mortgages are fixed rate, and in Australia, most are variable rate. In fact, almost 100%. Fixed rates only last 2 or 3 years. And so in Australia, if you got a mortgage 3 years ago at 2%, you're now paying 6.5% on the same mortgage. And there is not a lot of difference in the availability of homes in Australia compared to the US. So I think the difference of that fixed rate and people being, stuck with their cheap mortgage, oh, woe them, stuck with the cheap mortgage, is not as big as many people think, because that same pattern is happening globally of very few sellers and people sort of being patient because they can.
Vishaan, I have a question for you, which is one of the great white whales in New York City these days is the thinking that we have all these unused office buildings and that there's within them, if you just get the incentives right and just get it, could just convert these into apartments, you could go a long way to solving our housing problem because there's lots of empty space in these buildings. It sounds wonderful, but I don't see a lot of action. And I'm wondering, I imagine there's a reason for that, and was wondering if you could help us understand why this is difficult.
Sure, because most of the office buildings that we built that are now not doing well are very large floor plate and very expensive to convert to residential in terms of getting light penetration into them. The tax incentives they're looking at should work, but they're not going to put a major dent in our housing crisis because there's just not a lot of units that are going to come from that. Not to mention, you're talking largely about Midtown Manhattan, where there's not a lot of social infrastructure, there are not a lot of schools, there's not a lot of other things that people who want to live in neighborhoods need. So I'm not against the idea. I think it's a rounding error. Mm-hmm. I want to challenge a couple of this idea that there's no housing crisis. First of all, I can't speak to Melbourne or Mesopotamia, but in New York City, the vast majority of people are renters, about 85%. The vast majority of them are rent burdened. Even the people who are homeowners are mortgage burdened. There's extensive Furman Center documentation on that. So I think if the panel is about debating whether we have a housing crisis, then I don't know. I don't know exactly what to say to that. Secondly, there are examples where housing supply and demand have evened out. Tokyo, Austin, which has built a tremendous amount of housing, right? Again, it's like I can put the links in the.
Can I just push back on that then, Vishaan?
In the chat, sure, but while I have that, I mean, the thing is again, no one is saying magically that supply is going to solve the problem. I mean, Patrick's examples, I mean, there's some very interesting things in there. I don't know the numbers for Vancouver. How many housing units did they add versus how many people came? In New York City, and Patrick, that's just an open question, but in New York City, we are steadily creating 3 times the number of jobs than we are the number of housing units. Right? So that apartment that you used to live in, Aaron, yes, there is more competition from tech workers that didn't exist here before, right? From other kinds of workers that didn't exist here before. And so, we are a big polyglot city of 8 million people with a statue in the harbor that says, we accept people. We've got a conservative conversation going on in this country that's saying this country is full and the borders should be shut down. I would be frightened to think how un-New York it would be to say that the city is full and our borders are shut down. We have over 100,000 migrants that have arrived on our shores. We have 100,000 people sleeping on the streets, many of them children. And we have people fighting homeless shelters in neighborhoods. So
I would like to just jump right here, Vishaan. I think I love the conversation, and I'm really very grateful that we're actually able to have this conversation. But isn't it true that not all housing is built the same? Are we really going to solve the housing crisis if indeed we agree that there is a housing crisis, one luxury penthouse at a time?
Leila,
And
that's exactly why I
is
showed
there
an article. Leila,
is
that's
there
exactly why I showed the article that had 3 different housing types, including 6-unit wood buildings in the Bronx. Calling it all luxury penthouses, I don't think is useful.
Well, no, but my question is, is all housing made the same? And is a city, ought to use the mandatory tool, the mandate tool, to actually make sure that we create the type of housing that we need. New York is a as of right framework of development, which means that it is basically up to the market. But there is no such thing as the market. There are many sub-markets. So if the market right now is conducive to building luxury housing, because this is where maybe your buying force is less subject to mortgage fluctuations, because maybe they're going to buy their apartment with cash. This is where the market is going to respond. So I think that that we ought to bring a little bit more nuance to what it is that we are talking about.
So let's do that. I mean, so I think you're very well aware that mandatory inclusionary housing is in place for new development. And I think you're also very well aware that no, not all of the housing is the same. I mean, we're designing a 2,200 9-building complex in East New York in a largely low income, largely Black neighborhood that's 100% affordable housing from 60 to 120% of AMI. They have full community board approval because they desperately need the housing. That's a very different thing than talking about the housing on 57th Street. And so I totally agree with you. We need that nuance. But, to me, I mean, the question Patrick raised about how you tap into the land value that gets created from an upzoning is the critical question in terms of things like mandatory inclusionary.
Yeah, I would love to hear Patrick's thoughts.
Yeah, just very briefly, on the issue of is it like New York or not? I'm sort of with Cameron. It doesn't really matter where you are. If you're a global city and attracting global investment, Vancouver is one of those, New York is one of those, and we have been an arrival city like New York. So it doesn't seem to be, I'm kind of, I like the way Cameron describes it. He basically says, doesn't matter. Yes, we do have a housing crisis. My book talks about it and talks about the divergence of income relative to housing costs. So there's a lot of conversation about that, and that's hitting places like Vancouver and New York particularly hard. But over the longer term, particularly if you go to the beginning of the 20th century, for example, up to 1929, and the economic collapse, the threat of this thing called the crisis, reflecting on what Cameron is talking about, is continuous. And what you always have is an inability of, Marx uses the word proletariat, but let's use the word wage earner, the difficulty of the wage earner to compete for space in a market that makes that competition very difficult for that strata. That's the way I see it.
Cameron, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I can just share my screen quickly. Can you guys see my browser with some charts on it?
Yes.
So Vishaan said before, there is a crisis. And I'm not saying that rents aren't adjusting quickly. We have to also account for inflation, but here's rent to income ratio for Australian renter households. 20% in 1990, 20% in 2022. The crisis for private market renters was in the 2010s. Here we've got shelter cost to income for Canadian renters, pretty much a flat line for 20 years. We can look at the United States. we got a serious break here, but rent to after-tax income was essentially a flat line, and now it's another flat line after the series break. Let's do the UK, okay? Pretty much a flat line, and it's probably gone down, okay? I mean, Sydney real rents dropped something like 15% in 5 years, and we just forgot that that happened, and rents went up again, right? And so it's true. Here's rent to income ratio for renters from the survey of 5,000 people. There's a lot of low income, high rent to income ratio people, but there's a lot who aren't. And it's the competition between these groups of moving to bigger and better location and changing their household composition that leads to those means and medians that are essentially flat over time. So I just want to push back on that, yeah, okay, we can call it a crisis, but it's not abnormal, okay? We just really need to look frankly at the patterns through history. The other point I want to push back on is the idea that there are good cities that have solved housing with more supply. And the idea of Tokyo, the city that had the largest housing bubble in the 20th century and has had a massive economic recession for 30 years and has extremely, extremely low wages and the smallest dwellings, right, of all comparable global cities, I think is a terrible, terrible example. For example, in Australia, we could have 3 times as many people and not build a single extra dwelling and have more housing space per person than Tokyo, right? I think if we had Tokyo's housing outcomes in New York or any other city, people would hate it much, much more than what they hate about the current outcomes, right? Because we'd only have 30 square meters each, right? We'd have incomes that are a tiny fraction of those in New York City and really poor economic prospects. So I think that's a bad example. And Austin, I think, was the other one, right? If I pick any time in the last 30 or 40 years, the prices in Austin have risen faster than New York. If I go from 1990, go from 2000, go from 2010, go from 2020. So if it's true that they solved housing with more supply, then New York has done an even better job because their prices haven't been rising as fast for decades. So I just think, if we take a reasonable length of time, because, the argument is supply takes a long time, and really just look frankly at the data and the incomes of different places in context, we'll see that, yeah, there really isn't this utopia place that we can point to and say, here's a rich city with cheap houses, let's do what they did.
If I
The
might
only one
add,
I can think of is Vienna. I'm not sure how global a city that is.
I just wanted to add,
Yeah, well, it also has a large social housing sector, low population growth, and a pretty stable economy. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure people in Vienna are having the exact same Zoom meeting. I reckon we could dial into one where they're all complaining and saying, we need more social housing. Look at all the private renters getting squeezed out of Vienna.
Right. I've got a question here from an audience member here. A lot of the people in the audience are from New York City. Here's an interesting one. One of the things that New York State is trying to do, they've created some new incentives for developers here. It says here, New York State has approved a 35-year tax abatement for luxury condominiums. There's that phrase. At a value of over $1 million in exchange for creating, quote, affordable units. What are your thoughts? I have some thoughts about this, but I was wondering if the others would like to take a crack at this first. A 35-year tax abatement, please, Patrick.
yeah, well, the way it's stated, it sounds terrible, but I want to emphasize the point that that's basically requiring social benefit ends up being a land value tax because the cost of putting the building on top of that land stays pretty much the same with or without that unit in it. So if the municipality is demanding affordability, that'll change the way the project pencils out, and the land price residual will necessarily have to adjust to that. So that's why I use the example from Vancouver, which shows that they were able to extract 80% of the multiple $1 million increase in value from a rezoning and then use it for social benefit. I think the example that you described is pathetically small relative to what could be done.
I would add that the developers I've spoken to about this abatement, this 35-year abatement, don't like it in the least, because the abatement expires after 35 years, but the affordable units that they are supposed to create have to remain, what are called permanently affordable. So they see that as a mismatch, and this as an incentive to build housing. This doesn't seem like a very good one.
You know, that's some of my best friends are developers. I mean, that's what they do.
Right.
That's what they have to say.
Mm.
It makes perfect sense for them to say that, and they're not in a position to complain, except over the third beer, which has been my experience, about land price inflation. So that's very understandable.
Yeah, Aaron, can I jump in with a response
Please.
to that? I think, again, putting my economist hat on, one thing we find looking at US economic policy from abroad is that anything that isn't a tax break is socialism, but tax breaks are not for some reason, even though the net economic effect is the same. So, it puzzles me. We do the same thing here, that we can't just build or own or buy off the plan housing and rent it cheap to the people we want to live in cheap housing. What we have to do is we have to hide the subsidy and play this great political game of going, I'm not subsidizing you, I'm giving you a tax break. Okay, that's a subsidy, and you're going to deliver it. I'm like, but why not just do it? What's wrong? If you're giving up X million per dwelling per year in tax for an affordable home, why don't you just go to the developer and buy the dwelling off the plan and own it and rent it to whoever you want for as long as you want? Everything else is just a game for hiding that decision in some kind of tax so you can be not socialist or whatever the case may be. And I think we need to separate out these two things. You don't have to raise taxes from housing to subsidize housing. You can raise taxes in any efficient way you like and spend it on anything you want. Now, it just so happens that, as Patrick says, land value gains from public investment and upzoning are a great way to raise money because they're literally a free giveaway. And the way I describe upzoning is you can sell the rights. I mean, New York has air rights trading, right?
They do.
Why don't we sell the rights from the community, use that money to raise money and then spend it effectively, maybe just buying homes back off the plan. Now, it's true, Australia, actually, we have in the ACT a betterment tax, which is 75% of the land gain, and they raise a heap of money to spend on subsidized housing. So yeah, that's a great revenue source, but then bundling together, instead of taking the money and spending it on housing, hiding it by making them build the housing, is just making it more difficult. I mean, money is a great lubricant. Just take the money and spend it elsewhere. Maybe you need some of the site for public parks and maybe there's a negotiation, but yeah, take the money. You don't have to subsidize housing with taxes from housing. These can be thought of separately and do both as efficiently as possible.
I agree with all of that. I would add that the last time New York built a lot of affordable housing was in the 1960s, when the state and federal government got involved, and the rationale back then was just, as it started in the 50s, was we had soldiers returning from the war and we needed to house them, and those apartment complexes, were built. They are all over the city, and they are that was the last time really that New York really was, the government committed to affordable housing. It's ever since then, it's been a game of how do we subsidize developers, and as you've just explained, there are difficulties with that.
And if I can just interject on what you just said, Aaron, you're just spot on. What is interesting is that these units, I'm sorry, they have remained affordable. The Mitchell-Lama, the limited equity co-op that were built in the 60s, they are still here today. They still fulfill their mission of providing housing, and they have remained affordable. And they can, the limited equity co-op, we have a couple of those throughout the city, including in Manhattan. you're not trading the equity. The equity basically was never acquired, stays with the land, and it is never transferred. So you cannot sell your apartment for a profit. There's one example in the neighborhood of Chelsea in Manhattan, known as Penn South. The units, have house probably over 5,000 people. So I think that these are models that are true and tested. If I can just bounce on one other question, we've talked a lot about the supply side, but what about the demand side? How does one evaluate what the demand is, and what to make of that? And is there a question of equity in when we look at demand? I don't know who wants to take this one.
Cameron.
Well, maybe I'll just start. Like in the US, thinking about a single city, I mean, people can move to cities and out of cities, right? So, and they use their incomes and their opportunities in different locations to choose where to go. So there's no like stopping New York from people wanting to live there, right? Because you've got 300 million people who can move there if there's a good job anytime they want, if the quality of life, the net from the increase in income and the increase in housing makes sense. So I don't think that's a big thing. And I just to be clear, part of what we're seeing in housing is just inflation in the last few years, right? Incomes have gone up, other things have gone up in price, so has housing. And so when we go, oh, look, there's a lot of demand. I mean, demand is anchored, it's anchored by the incomes of people who want to live there. There is no demand above that, right? You can speculate on the asset value and be wrong. It might go up or it might go down. But in terms of living there, it's the incomes of people who are able to locate there that are what drives the rents, and which is why during a recession, incomes fall and people leave for other opportunities. So I think that's important to get right, and that's why it's important when you make comparisons with Tokyo, for example. Got to adjust for their incomes, because that's what people are using to outcompete each other for better locations. Does that make sense?
Got a question here from the panel. We have a lot of people here interested in housing policy questions. And this is for any panelist, from Holly. How would you recommend citizens participate in government to create affordable housing while maintaining quality of life, preserving history, and neighborhood charm?
Well, I'll a brief answer. That's precisely why I use the Cambridge example and foreground that. Even though my time was limited, it's very important that the example of working with communities, dialectically, if you will, cohabiting with communities and policymakers around a more insightful solution that recognizes the financial envelope that they are in, and drives the conversation based on who do you want to house. And one way of expressing that is we really want to house the younger generation who are service workers, or we really want to house our sons and daughters who have to leave this community because they can't afford it. The Cambridge example, the success of that example comes out of that conversation where I showed you the pictures at the end of prototypical structures that speak to things like historical qualities or neighborhood texture and all those things. The prototypes, if you're familiar with Boston, I mean, there's the three-decker, the three-decker, which in other parts of the United States is actually pronounced three-decker, but the kind of classic formal typologies of that part of the world were incorporated, and there's organic reasons why those housing typologies work there, and it's a base upon which you can extend and develop I mean, remember, this is doubling the density of those typologies, which is more than adequate, as the previous example suggested in using New York as the case study, way more than adequate just to grow housing up from its existing prototypes into something that is somewhat more robust across the broad landscape of that. Very, very doable. And that's, but the conversation had to ensue, and it had to be associated with your social objective, which was affordability for, you know, people, essentially for wage earners. And as the charts have sort of made, I think, clear, the housing crisis is not a crisis to the market, as Cameron would say. It's a crisis to the wage earners who are at that lower end, competing for this commodity, which is the market is saying is at this level. The market is performing perfectly. It's just that the larger culture is creating increased stress in the wage earning class that doesn't have access to the bank of mom and dad, is what it really comes down to.
On that note, we have a question here from an audience member. It says here, based on the information in the 2023 housing survey by the City Department of Housing and Preservation, 2 million rental units in New York City have 30,000 vacant apartments for a vacancy rate of 1.4%. But this does not count the 330,000 market rate units that are too expensive to rent for the groups that are rent burdened. How do we explain this state of affairs? To which I say, that's New York City for you. But Vishaan,
yeah, I've heard this statistic before, Aaron. I think there's a certain amount of frictional vacancy in any rent stabilized units. When people leave, landlords fix up units and so forth. 1.4% doesn't seem like very high in terms of that kind of frictional vacancy. And so I just want to build on something Patrick said, because I largely agreed, and I also largely agree with Layla about Penn South, but like put the two conversations together for a second, because I work with communities all the time in terms of advocacy for more housing, and communities often want more housing in their neighborhood. It's the right kind of housing, right? And so again, I go back to my example in East New York, you know, and building within the character of their neighborhoods and building for people who can afford to live in them. So Patrick's point about wage earners, and again, I'm not an economist, I'm going to wade into thin water, but my understanding is in the United States, wage growth has grown very little since 1980 relative to productivity. And so, you know, again, I'm going back to your example, Aaron, of your first apartment, right? So wage growth at the lower levels, minimum wage has barely gone up, right? And, you know, I think one of the big issues we have is that, you know, we talk about very high wage earners, software, real estate, those kinds of industries, Wall Street, and then you have people in fast food restaurants. We also have a bunch of people in the workforce, teachers, nurses, firefighters, who can't afford to live in New York City on their salaries, right? And I think we have what is basically a broken housing market. If someone who is a senior teacher can't afford to live in New York without some form of housing subsidy, housing subsidies they're scarce. We should be using them primarily for low-income people. But the problem is the market isn't giving middle-income people, you know, the ability to live here. And that is where I think, I go back to my article, opening up more housing in low, mid-rise areas, a lot of the things they're trying to do with City of Yes in terms of accessory dwelling units, right? This incremental idea, I think city planning calls it a little bit of housing everywhere, right? Has a lot of strength to it, because otherwise you're always caught in this binary of either no housing or what Layla keeps referring to as luxury penthouses. And I think the debate right now is in a very different place, which is how you create more housing for people of modest means across the city in hopefully a more modest scale than a lot of what we've seen. Towers can go in some places in Midtown Manhattan. That's a different issue, right? And so,
but Vishaan, how do you know that these units, and once again, I think you and I have had these conversations, and overall, I really agree that supply is part of the equation. But how do you know that these units that would be built would be affordable? Because once again, going back to the demand side, we don't control the demand, and there's an equity issue here where basically by the very nature of the market, if it is a free market, whoever has the largest means gets the unit. They will outbid the person who is a lesser earner. So how do you bring some stability and predictability so that, unless you go the route of Mitchell-Lama or public housing, I happen to believe that public housing is the gold standard. It is built entirely subsidized. It is capped at 30% of your income.
I mean, we should talk about why we can't build Penn South anymore and why we can't build public housing anymore.
But can we? Why should
no.
we?
So in 86, there was tax reform under Reagan. In 99, the Faircloth Amendment was passed. The federal government in the United States cannot build public housing by law. Of course,
But we're far from the cap on the Faircloth Act, far from the cap in New York State. So I think we could build another 1 million units before we hit the cap. Far, far from it. And by the way, AOC has a bill to repeal it. So we could.
I'm not saying we shouldn't build more public housing. What I'm saying is there's a whole set of reasons why we don't, right? That we absolutely should look at. I'm totally in agreement with you there. But at the same time, we also should look at whether if you went to propose Penn South today, right, how much of a welcome would it receive?
So it's going to be a little bit inside baseball for Patrick and Cameron, but Gary LaBarbera, who is the leader of the largest union, penned an op-ed 6 months ago in which he's basically saying, I'm game to build Mitchell-Lama, which, in essence is very similar to what Penn South ended up being. I would love for us to be, more bold in exploring other levels of affordability rather than, this 20/80 or 70/30, tax abatement. But I see that Patrick has his hand up. So
I just want to repeat a point that federal and state money is good and city taxpayer money is good, but land value is better. So if you can figure out a way to stream land value towards the social benefit that you want, that's a way better way to do it than continue to enrich land speculators who are essentially parasitic to the body public or the economy. I mean, that goes back to Adam Smith, that the capacity of land value to suck up all the value created by wage earners and entrepreneurs is legendary, and it's a consistent theme that comes through. So that's why I try to make it simple with the Cambridge example, basically by insisting that I'll give you the double density, but in return you have to guarantee affordability. And under no other circumstances do you get that. So what that does is it disciplines the land market such that it makes it pencil out, and the rents that normal people can afford to pay based on 30% of their income, monthly income, pencils out the deal for the construction and the maintenance over time. But unless you get a control on the land, the other way to do it is to just take tax money from different sources and go out there and buy that overpriced land, because in that case, you're competing with the market developments and it's still way too expensive.
One more question here from an audience member here. What is the impact of global elite speculation on housing stock for the ordinary urban dweller?
Can I just kick off that?
Please.
I don't have a lot to say because, there are effects in major global cities. I would say Sydney, Vancouver, New York for sure. And what I like to say to people in Sydney is that, yeah, your housing market's slightly different to, for example, Brisbane, where I live, because I don't have to outcompete Matt Damon to buy a house. But famously, all the Hollywood elite also want a house in Sydney and Byron Bay and these places. Of course, they're not really competing with, your generic house, right? They're in the sort of trophy home, which might be a completely sort of separate market and detached from the local market. But there is definitely this connection, and I'll get back to that spatial equilibrium idea that, wealthy people can live in any city around the world they want, and when they congregate somewhere, the values are going to go up in that city regardless of what you do to supply. And so I think there's we don't acknowledge enough that some of these cities are part of a global housing market, not just a local housing market. And so when there's competition for premium locations there, it's a lot of people competing with a lot of high incomes.
Can I just quickly add to that, because I don't disagree with anything Patrick said or Cameron said. It's just, I think a lot of people conflate speculation on wealthy apartments on 57th Street with gentrification going on in Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, and I think they have nothing to do with each other. And so we just need to be super careful. Like, I'm not exactly sure who you're gentrifying on Central Park South, but it's people may hate those towers for other reasons. But I have a very hard time believing that the competition for $20 million, apartments on 57th Street has anything to do with rents going through the roof, in Eastern Brooklyn.
One question I have for the panel, especially you economists out there, is, one thing that's been characterizing housing for the last 20 years is that interest rates were very low almost everywhere for a very long time. And that had all kinds of effects on, your mortgage. People refinance their mortgages multiple times, and the value of housing soared. That dynamic isn't here now, and for all we know, may not be back for quite some time. I wonder if we were to have this conversation in 2 or 3 years, we might be talking about the damage done to housing by, interest rates remaining wherever they are for the next period.
Yeah, I'll jump in there, Aaron, and I think you're spot on. As I said in my opening remarks, we've tried to make housing expensive to buy and develop right now with high interest rates or higher interest rates. And you're also right that the last 30 years have seen a structural decline in interest rates since the 1980s, with a couple of cycles in between, which of course justifies higher asset prices. So I do want to caution everyone on the call that price to income ratios are not very good measures of affordability when interest rates have changed so much and declined over time. Because of course, we can definitely reduce price to income ratio by putting interest rates up even further and orchestrating a market crash. We're not quite there yet, and I think you're right. A couple more years of these interest rates might change because, renting money is now a lot more expensive than renting a house, whereas go back 2 years and renting money was cheaper than renting a house. So everyone piled in. In fact, in Australia, we had record first home buying in 2021 because renting money became so cheap, and we had essentially 4 years of first home buying in 2 years. But that has reversed. And so we are at an unusual time in the cycle. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, this unusual time is also repeats historically. At the end of the 1880s land boom in Victoria, there was a period interest rates had fallen to 2%. You could get a 2% mortgage, and then they rapidly increased to 6%, and everyone thought the boom was over. And then there was another part of a boom at these abnormally high interest rates, and everyone was like, what's going on? And of course, there was the inevitable crash at the end of that decade. So yes, history repeats. Yes, we're at a strange point in the cycle, and I think we always need to keep that in mind, because it's not the sort of day-to-day nuances of planning in different cities that are driving these huge trends that are happening everywhere.
Patrick, I've got a question for you from an audience member. He asks, would housing prices in Vancouver gone down if developers had not been required to pay an 80% tax?
No, I don't think so. And the evidence is that they would not have gone down. Uh, it would take me a long time to go into that data, but trust me on that, that's not what happened. What happened was land that would have otherwise sold to the developer for 10 million sold to the developer for 2 million. And then at the end of the development deal, after people bought the condos, the agreed to 80% land lift went to the city to pay for all the goodies that they had been busy building all during that 3-year construction period. So no. And I think in general, just to follow up on that, the secret sauce, as probably Adam Smith through Henry George to Stieglitz, the secret sauce is to recognize that there's three factors of production. There's land and capital and wage earners, basically, and the one that is non-productive in that scheme is land. And unfortunately, land has an infinite capacity to take unto itself that capital, which is almost magically created by the participation of wage earners and entrepreneurs, until the point of collapse, which is what Cameron alludes to in the cycle. There is this cycle, but I'm describing that same cycle in a different way. So the conundrum is solved by policymakers if they recognize this issue of land and do the appropriate things to make sure that land value gets streamed to social benefit. And nobody's the loser, because the land sells for more than it would have. You know, the market is supporting that. It's just a matter of who gets the benefit. It's either the society or the person who's speculating on the land.
It's getting late, except in Australia where it's still pretty early. So I just have one more question, and it's for Vishaan, which was your article in the New York Times, the one that talked about how New York City has the space now to build, quite a bit of housing. I thought was the most hopeful thing I'd seen on the subject in a long time. And it's always struck me that everybody agrees and has agreed for a long time that New York needs more housing, but nobody wants it built next to them. That's been the dynamic as long as I can remember. And I think that's true broadly in most East Coast, West Coast cities as well. And I'm curious if you think anything is changing on that front. I get the sense that our mayor, Eric Adams, is more friendly towards the idea of developing than some of his predecessors, but I don't know. And I'm curious what you think.
Well, again, I appreciate what you said. Look, to me, this is not a binary of build or don't build. This is a question of what to build. And again, things that have nothing to do with building, that are policy issues that extend beyond this in terms of the demand side, wages, land prices, as other panelists have discussed. What I discovered in the process of doing that article and doing those visualizations is that communities were actually quite open to the housing that was suggested in that article. The preservation community was quite open to the housing that was suggested in that article. And I think the reason is it had a certain nuance to it. Patrick had a slide that said design matters. I think design does matter. Because I think people are tired of these lobotomized blue glass towers that we seem to be the only thing that we produce in our cities today. And there is another option. To me, the question is who's going to build it. Layla's, and then who can afford to live there. Layla has brought up this thing about bringing public housing back, bringing back some of the union housing and so forth. That is a direction. I believe we need to focus much more on smaller scale builders and developers, minority-owned builders, women-owned developers, people who want to and will get up out of bed every morning to build a 60-unit housing and do it with quality and care of design and community engagement in these places. And I think the conversation would change from this binary that we're caught in to something that is much more nuanced. And then you have to think about the policy issues of, do you do land value capture from an upzoning? Do you use that to subsidize housing? For whom? And again, the construction costs matter as well as the land costs in terms of the different scales of housing that I showed in that article. And so to me, there's clearly the capacity, and I think there could be the public will. It's just a question of getting out of this kind of 2019 box of we're either building no housing or 70-story towers in your neighborhood that no one asked you about and no one really wants. And I think that is where we need to head as a city.
I hope we get there. I hope we get there. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been enlightening and fun. I hope the audience enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Layla, thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really want to thank the audience. I want to mention that we currently have a little over 130 participants on the call, and this is when we're wrapping up. We started at a much higher number. Actually, not that much higher. People have actually steadily stayed with us, and we're really grateful for this level of participation. I want to remind everybody that you can find the City Club of New York on our YouTube channel. This event is being live streamed, and it will be available for replay as soon as it concludes. We're also available on social media. I want to thank Professor Patrick Condon. Patrick, your book, Broken City, is coming out on May 28th. Vishaan Chakrabarti, your book, The Architecture of Urbanity, published by the Princeton University Press, is coming out in September of this year. And Dr. Cameron Murray, your book, The Great Hijack, The Hoaxes and Myths, Keeping Prices High for Renters and Buyers in Australia, came out in February of this year and is published by Allen and Unwin. I want to thank Maria McMahon and Rachel Miller, who helped put together this event. It is a team effort. I want to thank really my friend Aaron Elstein for moderating this conversation. We know that these conversations at times can be difficult to have, and the City Club of New York really believes that these conversations are essential. We really need to be able to explore the subject of housing, the policies around housing, bring more subtlety. And I really appreciate this healthy conversation with participants who don't necessarily share the same views, but are able to actually help the audience, help our policymakers, help maybe an industry even grow in their thinking and their approach of this really important topic. So, finally, I want to thank New Yorkers and all other city dwellers and folks from all over the world who participate in housing, in urban and land use planning process. Our voices matter. Our voices are really important, and I'm really grateful for this community engagement, whether you are from New York or you are in Canada, in California, in Finland, in Germany, or in Italy. This is actually the level of interest that we have received for this event. I'm really grateful. And I thank you all for being with us tonight. And I wish you a very good night or a good morning if you're in Australia. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.